Hello. Today we are here with our 31st podcast, and we will be talking about amazing things, which are what can be done compassionately to stop this COVID. And what a title! So today, our hosts Candy and Mark Sheehan. And Mark Sheehan will be leading us in that conversation about what is this compassionate way. And the reason I wanted to share this subject is that many of us receive multiple things in the mail. And Candy and I shared both that we received exactly the same item, which is called imprimis. When I looked at the title, it is called A Sensible and Compassionate Anti COVID Strategy. And I thought, oh, finally, somebody has a good and solid scientific approach to how to um, stop this coronavirus pandemic. So then I started paying attention to who is the author of this particular publication, and that was a Stanford University professor in medicine and economics. So I started reading that, and I have to admit that since we are on the coping topic, I think one of the important topics when we cope is fear and anxiety. And when we receive publications such as this, or any publication that we trust, or we are just about to learn about what is this author saying, then I think it is important to understand that we also cope with information. We cope with anything that we read and we watch on TV, right?
Mhm.
So that's what today I thought we will be talking about. What is that compassionate solution to end the pandemic, but also how helpful are authors who propose such publications, especially under titles like that. So I know that we are here today with Candy and Mark, and also with Scott Kiddle, who is our regular host. So thank you so much
Hi.
for being here today. And I invite you, Candy and Mark, to start this conversation. And first of all, Mark, since you are here with us on Saturday, first time, I want you to begin with introducing yourself.
Liddy, I'm sorry. We lost your sound for just a minute, and I'm not sure we know
Okay,
what you said.
okay. I said, can you introduce yourself, Mark, since you are our first time guest here on Saturday Coping Live Talk?
Here we go now.
Can you hear that? Okay.
Well, I think what you said was just kind of kick this off. Imprimis is a publication of Hillsdale College. Uh, in this particular uh, uh, piece, he argues that if you look at the numbers, you look at the statistics, there's probably far more cases than we factor into our study of COVID. Uh, and there go the actual death toll is not as high and over accentuates all the dramatic steps taken to do that. The reason I had mentioned that I was interested in this is because I, long before this, years ago, bought this book, The Truth Matters, and it's by Bruce Bartlett, who has a whole uh, lineage of working. He is a Republican. He goes most prominently with George Bush, but he dates back 30 years. So what it amounts to is he says you have to be very, very careful of what kind of information you take in, teaches you how to evaluate it in different ways. And one of them that even after having read it several years ago, the thing that struck me and stuck in my memory was that he said, be careful about think tanks. That at one point, uh, think tanks were measured by how much balanced information they gave to those people who subscribed to it over the evolution of time, and 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 as our culture has switched, think tanks became advocacy pieces. So if you look at what Mr. Bartlett suggests, look at imprimis as a product that's being delivered to you for some reason. They have over 5 million readers monthly. There's not a dime expected from anyone. I don't know how we got on the subscription list or how you did, but it is by if you go and look at their site, is they are spreading the message, and that message is in this case to promulgate a libertarian, in a broadest political term, a libertarian point of view, and the way that distills down is governments keep government out of everything. It's the old Reagan line: "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." So their position is that well, you just wonder why you get the one doctor who is this administration's kind of golden voice on this, of herd immunity. It is the idea that government really can't do anything for you; just get through it. And it's a Darwinian. Let the extension of that is the strong will survive, and the harshest read of that is it's just old people dying. You know, that's the most caustic way. So that's kind of an overview of why would Imprimis send this out. And I will kind of open it up. And if anybody has any questions, I didn't really get the prompt from you completely, Lydia, but I hope I stumbled somewhere across what you were interested in.
Oh, absolutely. And I guess I goofed not sending you questions because I know that you have this whole perspective on the information as a professional journalist. And that's what I thought we will talk today. And I invite you, since I did not send you questions, to think about, first of all, what is trustworthy information, how to find the source that you could really rely on, and also about how people make decisions, who to trust, what source of information can they trust. And I will say a little about that. But for example, in this publication that we brought up today, right on the cover, we see that it is 5,600,000 readers monthly. That's told me immediately, right? So that's a very trustworthy source. Then it's also told me, of course, who is this particular author, Jay Bhattacharya, who is, as I said, medical and professor, and also professor in economics. And so he talks about his goal, and his goal is, of course, to review the facts of about how deadly COVID is. So that got my attention because I know that how polarized is our society right now. Talking about, some people say, oh, this is just like a flu-like. Others are absolutely horrified and terrified because this is the mortality rate is so high. And this is all around the world. And so, and of course, since the title, and that's what I also wanted to talk about, since when you gave me the titles of the books, that's probably took all my attention because I immediately got the books. And what I've read about this book that you mentioned about the truth, and it's exactly how deceiving could the title be.
Exactly.
And that's why I wanted to bring up this into this conversation today, also ethics, professional ethics of those who write and those who publish. And since you're a journalist, I thought you just really, it's your topic. But here he says, continues, my goal is, first of all, again, present the facts about how deadly COVID actually is. And it kind of alarmed me right away. So I thought, oh, there are some new facts, and maybe some research is done. Though back in October, we had a very interesting conversation with Paul Burmenko, who talked about not only the stages of vaccine development, but also he reviewed how the whole pandemic started and what it led to, and how that the behavior, this sort of individualistic attitude to many people that, I have a freedom to not wear the mask, not to stay home, that caused such a huge scope of this pandemic development. But so I just want to read a few facts from this particular publication. For example, so the author argues about the mortality rate that first was published as the 3%. And so this professor of medicine and economics says that actually when they reviewed the number of cases in different states, so then they figured it out that actually it's not 3%, but he even says 0.2%, which is a huge difference, because that means 2 people out of 100 die from COVID rather than 3 people out of 100, right? So I thought that does not sound right, because we see other publications where it's still, yes, maybe not 3%, but still very high. But also, then the same author on page 3 says that whereas COVID is not deadly for children, for older people it is much more deadly than the seasonal flu. And we know that, that's a fact. And it was publicized and also spoken about the deadliness for older generation, 70 plus. And so he actually raises that mortality rate from 3% to 4%, which means that if people are older than 70, then 4 people out of 100 die from COVID, while for younger people, it is actually 2 out of 1,000. So that's kind of where I wanted to say. But the reason it got my attention was the author argues and invites people to change policies based on this data, that when people know that it is not as deadly, then he advocates for not closing businesses and not closing schools, and for opening all museums and then entertainment centers. And he said simply, this is what got my attention, that those who are not vulnerable should immediately be allowed to resume life as normal. So what do you think about that, Mark and Candy and Scott, and especially Mark, since we are talking about journalist ethics and ethics of scientists? So when a person advocates in the midst of pandemic, resume to normal activities now when we are pushing 14 million cases, and practically 350,000 deaths. So how would you look now at the title of this publication, A Sensible and Compassionate Strategy? How would you talk about that?
One thing that I'd like to just bring up, and because I want Mark to think about this too, I've always had a very high regard for really reputable newspapers like the New York Times or the Washington Post. And I've always felt like if they put a story in, not an opinion piece, but if they put in a hard news story, that I could probably trust the facts, because they had to have sources and it was vetted, kind of, more or less. And, I read in the Washington Post just this morning, it was a study out of Johns Hopkins University of Medicine, and it was updated on 12/5. And it said that whereas this guy in this writing said it was 0.2% fatality rate, this said it was 1.9%, which was to me a huge difference in the mortality rate.
Yes.
And so for me, I wanted to talk about sources of information And, you know, I got my news out of Washington Post, and I just felt like it was more reliable. And so I'd like for Mark to kind of talk about that, maybe.
Yes, thank you, because that's what exactly I wanted to find out. Like people are coping with
Yes,
their fear and anxiety, and plus then they get different sources and they don't
right,
know what to read, right? So they
right,
lose the trust. So
right.
Mark, could you, yes, help us to kind of cope with these multiple resources that argue with each other?
Uh, 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 of course, the advantage to print journalism or major network national newspapers is that there is a process. You have editors, a line of editors. There are standards of what actually gets into a newspaper or gets on air, and there is a culling system. That's not to say that this doctor doesn't have that, but again, if you go back to Bartlett, what he says is that there was a time where you could trust things. Now you really can't. You have to look into them. So I looked up his. There's a lot of boilerplate there, but the specific one is uh, he is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. And as Bartlett tells you, start looking up where the money comes for these things. Freeman and Spogli are venture capitalists or investment capitalists, investment bankers. They were huge fundraisers for Bush. Uh, 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 Freeman, I think, one of them, I should have taken better notes of that. One of them ended up being a ambassador to Italy. The other one ended up getting George W. Bush's cat. He thought he was going to be the CIA director. But the point is, they have a vested interest. So then you have to wonder, what's the vested interest? Why is he putting this out? Well, while we're arguing about the death percentage, we're ignoring the fact that again, if numbers don't lie, but liars tend to move numbers around. If we were focused on that, we're not looking at the fact that Canada, right next to us, death rate per capita is 40% less than ours. That means that we've lost 200,000, we've lost 80,000 more than they did in Canada. We're not discussing that. We're trying to say, is this really dangerous? Is it really not? Well, if we get to 300,000, it's 120,000. There may be an ethical question. Well, they're all old people, so we're really saving money in that Darwinian. But you have to wonder. You go back to why are people funding? Because if you look at the Imprimis or Hillsdale, they have a long line of what they call Western culture advocates or conservative economists or libertarian voices, but it really comes down to get out of the way of business. And that comes from Justice Lewis F. Powell and the Powell Memorandum. You may want to look it up, but it is our government is best when it's not. The least amount of government is the best amount of government. So why are they anti-science? Well, the people that are paying for this tend to come from several funding sources. Richard Mellon Scaife, Charles and David Koch, Joseph Coors was a big early spender. There's a guy in Missouri, Seinfeld. I can't think. Seinfeld. But they're
Jerry?
billionaires who spend money. For example, the Kochs make their money in petroleum. Well, they don't want scientists telling them that they're polluting the environment. Regulation tends to limit what big business can do. And so their philosophy is let's protect big business. and so you just have to wonder how you can have a current of thought that says doing the scientifically smart thing is best for the country when other countries are succeeding at this. And there are just ample examples of countries around the world who have done a much better job than we have.
Right.
And it's largely because we take a hands-off, really you can do what you want. It's really, we're a country where freedom comes first no matter what, even in a public health catastrophe. And Scott, I think you probably know, have some thoughts about
It's actually
that.
Well, yeah.
absolutely right. So go ahead.
So on the subject of big business or particular business interests driving this kind of information, it's just an interesting piece of information that, number one, the stock market had a banner day here just recently that topped over 30,000. Right. So the stock market is like, pandemic, I don't care.
Right.
Right.
And then the company that I work for, although we have had one part of our market decrease significantly, we actually have had one of the best years business-wise than in our whole history. So yeah, there's an economic impact, but the market just has this way of flourishing, right?
Right.
It does.
Right.
Which is not to diminish anything that you said, but it's just some interesting pieces of information, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Mark, and in the book that you just, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say that in the book that you recommended for this particular conversation, The Truth, the author talks exactly what you just brought up. And of course, I try to catch up, and it's impossible to do it in one day. So I really want to hear more about this book and the other book about is it evil geniusness or something like that. So I really look forward to hear from you. But in this book particularly, the author says that how the corporations during periods like this one, they actually benefit from loans. And again, who gets the money? The money go to the executives and to their salaries and to benefits and bonuses. And so, and that's what this author says, that when we talk about the general public that chooses who to trust, it's such a big difference between people who are on the top and people who are not on the top, on the bottom. And so, could you say a little more about what this author talks about, how people make decisions who to trust?
And to that end, the danger is right now that we are just bombarded with social media.
Yeah,
we are bombarded. We can go to Google. We can get tons of information. We go on Facebook or Reddit. We are forced almost into silos of information, so that when we look at the stock market hitting 30,000 for one side of the country, it is we couldn't be richer.
Yep.
On the other side, it is the gap between the 1% and the rest of the world couldn't be wider.
That's true.
And so you get those two conflicts. What's really perplexing is that the people who are what has happened in the past is that the people left out tended to hate Wall Street, tended to hate, but they have been there is enough information on the social media. I'm never quite sure how to best phrase that we've turned our debate within the country is less about who gets money, but it is Confederate statues, people kneeling at
Oh yeah.
football games,
Yeah. Yeah.
at and so they're polarizing. You hear in this literature that we were looking at today, they talk about, or in the background of it is that they lift up Western culture. Well, that's if from the other side that says white European culture,
Mhm.
and um, so people who don't have much they see the main issue as gun control. They're going to take your guns away. Abortions, which now, uh, as painful a subject it is, really is statistically, if you do that with COVID, 200,000 or 300,000 is still a tragedy, but that is part of what drives uh, people into these silos. Well, this is what I believe. If you drive through Northwest Missouri, and I didn't understand what was going on, but you see all these flags with blue stripes in them, and sometimes they're black American flags with a blue stripe, and that is someone is that is being driven. It is a counter to Black Lives Matter.
Um,
So if you don't, if you, it's not that you don't think Black Lives Matter, but if you see the country as being taken over by socialists, well, that's your way of saying, well, I believe in law and order. I believe in policemen.
mhm.
And so all these different vehicles to sell these messages, COVID's not that bad. Just learn to live with it. Defend your freedom more. Worry more about your freedom than whether your grandmother dies. It drives people into two different flanks. The real danger is how do you ever get uh, anything? How can you ever accomplish anything as a society? We can never build the interstate system. We can never do the land grant colleges that came out of the Civil War. The things that we have done collectively are really impossible now, and it's
And
because
it's very interesting what, yeah, very interesting what you just brought up, how people choose to trust a certain source, that it is based on either people's religion or their ideology or fear of socialism or fear of democracy or opposite. And of course, like this man, he is seems like, even though he brings up that he came up with these research results, talking to other specialists who came from like a broad spectrum of the political views. But the truth is that when we make a decision who we trust, we still base it on our vested interest. So it's either religion, it's our politics, our preferences, but also it is a very interesting aspect of how we make a decision. It is based on when we look around and read what we read, and we also compare with what our families members say, what our friends say, what our church members say. And interestingly enough, we listen to that average opinion because nobody wants to fall out of the wagon. Nobody wants to be on the back of the train, right? So tell me a little about this, how we make a decision because we want to be a part of the crowd. We don't want to stick up. And I'm from the former Soviet Union. And I remember how my mama always told me, you need to be a little bug. Don't stick up your head. Otherwise, it will be up. And so, and I want to talk a little about that. So why people are so inclined to belong to a certain camp rather than critically thinking and developing that skill. And that's another conversation that I really am interested in, critical thinking. How do we make decisions? But so why is that we want to belong to a group, to sort of a crowd?
And the thing that's so interesting, I have to add this too because I didn't know. And I rarely get on social media anymore. I don't do Facebook. I might look at it once a week, maybe, or I might not. But what I found out was Facebook knows me so well. They were only sending me things that they knew would appeal to me. likewise,
Right.
I have family members who don't really share my views or my values so much. They get a whole different set of stuff, and
Oh yes.
that's when I really
Yeah.
finally figured that out. I thought, no more Facebook. That's just not good at all.
Abs-
I have I'm sorry, that's our clock. I can't stop it.
it's absolutely true because
Yeah,
this is how our interests are followed by
right.
certain social media channels, right?
Right. And I have some friends that they come out to me with such far out ideas. And I think, who could ever believe that in their right mind? And it's because it was sent to them and repeated thousands of times. And then they believe it as truth. I told a friend once, I just said, she said, well, it's on the internet. I said, no, that doesn't mean it's true. I mean, please check the facts. Don't send that stuff. So I don't know how do we get people to be thinking a little bit more critical and not accepting everything that comes across their own personal
Exactly.
news feed. What can
Right.
we
So
do about
help us, Mark, with that. It's really people wrestle with that.
Yeah,
it?
man. I think part could undoubtedly, Kenny and I have thought about this. Part of it is that we are becoming a society that says you can never compromise.
Mm-hmm.
The other side is an enemy. Their ideas have to be crazy rather than empirically look of what is the problem, how do we address the problem, and what can we learn from other countries. The South Korea has a tiny number of deaths, even minuscule when you do per capita. But they have experience and they have background. So where the crossover is, let's say we follow this infamous article and say, well, the point 8 or 2 points. Well, then how do we deal with it? Let's not argue about whether you believe that number or I believe this number. They said, well, let's look at those people. Let's look at who actually has it, identify them. They did massive testing when they found a case, and the case really was centered in Daegu, which I've been to twice, a huge a city of probably 7 to 11 million people. And they came in, identified uh, uh, who had been exposed, who had been around someone that had it, and they isolated all those people in there. So in a town of 11 million, it did come down to maybe 4,000 people, but they went and found those 4,000 people immediately, and did contact tracing. They isolated the people that even were asymptomatic because they spread it. And
Mm-hmm.
so, in our approach, though, was we were reluctant to test because it only showed more cases.
Mm-hmm.
We denied the actual numbers or where it was at. And so instead of looking at science and following through on it, so how do we get to a country where you can compromise and say, well, let's be reasonable about this? A mask costs $10 and can cut deaths by, let's say it cuts death by only 20%. Well, that'll be 60,000 people we saved while we're looking for or while we're getting this vaccine. And if you look at the countries in Southeast Asia that have done better, they have had earlier experience with airborne flus, and everyone wears a mask in Korea, even when it was not a pandemic. Maybe 70% of the population typically wears a mask. There's just nothing to that. So we've gone to a point where we're the brightest people with the best doctors and the best hospital and the best scientists, but we can't have an adult conversation on what are the basic steps and how do we best protect our society and build for a better society. And if it all comes down to if Wall Street is successful and it's gone to 30,000, then individual uh, uh, death rates doesn't matter much to Wall Street as long as they're making as much money as they can. So it is it's a hard place to get to, and part of that is that there's just such a lot of money being spent to calcify our underlying fears and beliefs.
And I kind of
It's
like to just emphasize something he said, because this is where I get kind of off track sometimes. I argue about the numbers. It doesn't matter. That's not what matters. Is it 0.2% or is it 1.9%? That really is not the critical
No,
thing. The
no.
critical idea is do the right thing and try to turn this around. Mark and I are being very careful. We're protecting ourselves because of our age group and our risk factor. But on the other hand, even if I were a young person, I believe I would wear a mask because it's for the common good.
Yeah.
And what I'd like for us to do is get back to a point where I can think about the common good. It's not just about me because I'm old and I have underlying conditions. It's what's right for our society and caring enough about someone else to do the right thing. And so I wish we could get to that point. And the other thing he said that I just want to emphasize, because I'm bad at this, is being able to listen to the other person's argument. It's not my way always. I want to hear the other side and see if I can't find some common ground that we can move to. So now I'm going to listen again.
that. Thank you. And you are a very good listener, by the way. I will argue with that. So, but what I wanted, yes, go ahead, Scott.
Well, Candy, I think you're pointing to a cultural problem, a cultural issue in our country. You know, uh, we are of the generation that idolized John Wayne, the rugged individualist who
Sure.
does everything himself and answers to no one, right?
Mhm.
And although there's not many of that generation left, we still have every advertisement says you deserve this,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
Right.
And so it turns us inward. It makes us more self-centered.
Mhm.
And so to think about the common good is almost foreign. Oh, we might pay lip service to it culturally, but really, our culture is very self-centered.
True.
And it's very true, absolutely. Because when, again, coming back to the title of this article, of this publication, that is Sensible and Compassionate Anti-COVID Strategy. And then when this author, Jay Bhattacharya, offers to open immediately businesses and especially entertainment centers, theaters, museums, restaurants. And we know what already happened when restaurants are open. And remember how slow the number of cases grew here in St. Joseph, Missouri, though we are very close to Kansas City. And of course, we are far from Columbia, or where there are lots of cases, and especially St. Louis. But people travel, and gradually it came here. So now we have our hospital is full.
Mhm.
And the problem with that is I consulted with Paul Burmenko when I read this article, and I said, okay, so why do I have such a wrong feeling about it? Because now, when, for example, many governors announce and actually the visitation and the celebration during Thanksgiving was equal to misdemeanor, and the fee penalty was $1,000. So, and at the same time, I'm reading this publication, and I thought this just does not come together. And that's what I know, that many people will wrestle and many people will struggle. So I asked Paul Burmenko, who really had this kind of a really good head on his shoulders. And so what he says, and actually will quote him, he said that yes, maybe for younger population it is 0.2% mortality rate, because you see that's a problem, that the author does not say the average, like what Candy you brought up, like
Right.
1.9. Other
Yeah.
sources say 1.5. okay, even if it is 1.2, since Paul Burmenko is a very good data specialist and very ethical, and he's also a statistician, he says that this 0.2% will infect. See, he always calculates from 100 to 200 million people around the world in 18 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
So also he says, then what does it lead to? Hospitals are overwhelmed and overloaded, and then that increases the mortality because people will be packed. And
Mhm.
like I remember when I went to Mosaic ER, I was told that there is no way to direct the flow of COVID patients from people who come with heart disease, cancer, or maybe blood pressure problem. So they put them all in the same rooms, one after another. So you see, that's what I think. I trust what Paul Burmenko said in his conclusions. Also, remember how he spoke about how Taiwan and China, they just simply immediately closed businesses. Germany attempted that. Closing businesses for 2, 3 weeks would be economically justified faster than what we have now, because of course now try to close businesses, right? So because this author advocates against the lockdown, he actually says deadliness of the lockdowns, and he talks as a medical professional about how detrimental it is for people's health, um, mental health, lots of depression, lots of, and that's what we are talking here about, coping emotionally, coping physically. And so, and again, why other countries were able to do that. This is what I think, Scott, you brought up, and you both, Candy and Mark, talked about, that this attitude, like, I deserve it. It's my
Mhm.
freedom. I
Right.
cannot, I'm not going to give it up. But then if we have advocacy for younger people and middle-aged people to go around, the problem again, quoting Paul Burmenko, is that America does not test children for COVID.
Right.
And so when the author says, well, this is just for all the generation to choose, and if they are comfortable, then they can go to the restaurant and have families, or just meet with them on a parking lot. So I just don't feel it is right for the
Mhm.
society as a total to separate those who are vulnerable, and it's just like, okay, if they are comfortable, why can't we all look at ourselves as one society? People who are responsible for each other. That's what I thought we need to spend time a little on this. Like, how can we really take responsibility, not only for us, for ourselves, but for others? And so, what is that? And I want to address Mark again, because Mark is such a specialist in Russia.
Yeah.
And as I many times told that, the history of my country more than I do. And I remember this book. I remember the book that you gave me, Mark, while you were thinking about how to answer that question. And I apologize. I really challenged you today. But I think that makes a conversation. So you gave me this book, Marshall Tipo, about the Russian moment in the world history. So I will
Oh,
handle it like this. And we can see Stalin on the, it really amazing, amazing, eye-opening book for me, because just this week I thought, what a good time when we not a lockdown, but my grandchildren, my granddaughters, they study at home. They do not go to school, and like many children, study online. And I thought, how could I help a little when I have time? So I decided to read a book to my little granddaughter who is 7. And this book is about Russian history. And of course, it is all about Russian warriors and soldiers. And this is back during the Mongol Tatar siege. And the way I grew up, but after reading your book, I'm just in a sense of shock, because when we believed that Russia was under 450 years under this Mongol siege, and then how they burned villages and cities and churches and raped women and just left a burned ground, like Germans did during the World War II. So reading this author, I realized it wasn't really like that. And so now, reading this book of history in Russian to my little granddaughter, I said, what am I teaching her? I need to teach her the truth. I need to teach her how it was. But of course, Russian warriors are shown like heroic and very patriotic, and then they, of course,
Oh yes.
they liberate the land and people. And I thought, well, now I know a little more on another side. It's really eye-opening. So could you talk a little about that? What can we learn from other cultures from this point and in this time in history?
Well, I wasn't going to probably bring up Russia, but I will, because you have that. Their idea of peaceful transfer of power was assassination.
Oh yeah.
But that's beyond that. I also have beyond this fascination with Russia and an obsession with Jack Benny and the Jack Benny radio shows. And so I have hours and hours and hours of them that I sometimes when I go to bed, I'll just listen to them just to kind of let me go to sleep. A recurring message. Remember, this came through the World War II. It is our enemy will do everything they possibly can to divide us. And that was sent time and time and time again, not just on Benny's show, but through the war. Don't let them divide us. You skip to this day, today, Russia is involved in, with its weakened economy, its instability of going from the fall of communism to Putinism. They are now pushing active measures and not singular, and not, they had active measures back with the old KGB. But just one example I thought of was some of the roots of the anti-vaccination, the anti-vaxxer, that was driven by Russian propagandists seeding that. And they have, and I'm just now reading a book by Clint Watts that has a section on how they actually inject propaganda into our culture, and he speaks about the anti-vaxxers. Well, it separates society. Whenever Black Lives show up, they will send messages to that community to get the other side riled up. Part of what is happening, part of the reason we're divided, is our enemies couldn't enjoy it more. That we are divided. And then and before we've been off on this, because I think Russia is not alone in trying to divide us. But if you go back to my thought that we had to compromise, and this guy saying, "Well, open everything up." Well, the reality is you ought to be able to identify those communities. And early on, it was in 40 miles from Lewis McCord, where I was doing an exercise. They could have isolated it then. Aside from that, the bigger argument is we ought to shut down bars and beauty shops and fingernail places and keep our schools open. Spend as much money as it takes to do the testing to keep our schools open, because that opens up all other kinds of avenues for our society to operate normally. But we can't. You shut down a bar, and all of a sudden they have pictures in Wisconsin of all these college kids just proud that they're defying the government. You can't tell me I can't drink on a Wednesday night in Madison, Wisconsin if I want to. Well, we shouldn't have to. It should be, well, let's look through this next 6 months. These are the things that we can do, and you can help us do that. But it is, and it's not that we just had a poor job of messaging. As a society, we can do this better. And probably it's right. You can't just say, "I'm going to give you a ticket if you don't do it." It took a long time for seatbelts to come in, but to say just that constant message, let's work together on this and try to figure out We all want the same thing. We want our kids educated in the classroom. We could, if we took the money that we're spending now. Oh my gosh, the trillions that have gone, to save our economy. We could have done a lot of these things, but instead we propped up industries that undoubtedly needed propping up, but some industries did very well.
Mhm.
But we didn't look at how do we function as a society, how do we work together as a society, and uh, there is part of freedom is that obligation to make sacrifices for the whole, and that's the part, Scott, where you're talking about. It is what's in it for me.
Absolutely.
That's just what's in it for me.
Do you know, I want to say
Thank you.
one thing too that I read in, no, I'm not sure where I read it, but I like Dr. Sanjay Gupta. He's one of my favorites. He's a CNN contributor, so that's kind of where it's coming from. But he said that really things could go back to normal if we were willing to do just a few things. He says you would have to wear a mask, you'd have to social distance, and then there were 5 things he said that really caused 80% of the spread. And he said it was restaurants, it was cafes, it was bars, it was churches was number 5, because he says, if you're in a mega church and they're saying that it is a real spreader. And there was one other one, and I'm not sure if I'm going to call up what that 5th one was. But he says if you were just willing to do that much, then life could kind of go on like normal and we would be okay. But we have people who won't wear a mask or who won't distance. Yeah. And like Mark said, there'd be a big protest about the bars. And I'm sorry about the restaurants because I don't want them to close. But maybe if we just didn't go in the restaurant, pick it up at the door, there would be ways that maybe we could help them too. But there are just certain things that we really have to be willing to do. And to me, that's reasonable. That's not too hard to do. We could do it if
absolutely. And I really think that what you described, just a second, is what one of the answers to the question, what is the compassionate way to end this pandemic? So Scott, go ahead.
So we've been talking a lot about the mortality rate of COVID, and it could be argued, well, it's less than the flu every year. However, one thing that we've not touched on yet today is the ongoing health impact of people who have survived COVID, but now they've got long-term health impact. There's not really a lot of numbers yet that's available for that, but I was just curious and I looked it up. There was a study that was done on the long-term effects of SARS, which was the first coronavirus that came out in 2003. And the study showed that there was persistent and significant impairment of capacity and health in survivors of SARS over 24 months. And another study revealed that 40% of people recovering from SARS still had chronic fatigue symptoms 3.5 years after being diagnosed. Right. So this is quite a bit more than just, grandma and grandpa might die. Right. But there are that are being impacted with long-term damage to heart, lungs, brain, nervous system, mental health, musculoskeletal impact. So it's more than just fatality.
And it's absolutely true. And what I want to add before, sorry, Mark, one of the side effects in children, I've read one of the studies showed that in boys, it is infertility. So when they will grow up, they might not have children. So, and it's a serious side effect that maybe now children don't have any symptoms. But if they had the virus in their bodies, they might deal with this later, maybe like 15 years later. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, and so so if you look at this as they're trying to sell something, this is not just some doctor. In a lot of these cases, they get their their grants, their money as they go through school to be libertarian doctors, to be and it's easy. It is easy to it is there's every reason to think that libertarian has a value of trying to limit the amount of government you have. But so they are selling a point of view. It's only 1%. It's not that big of a deal. The next step is it's not that much worse than flu, but we know 240,000 people don't die in a year from flu, so it's not
Exactly.
like every other flu, and that
Right.
it only hits certain people. The people it hits, it hits very, very hard, as Scott says, and it goes on. And the military, the just because I happened to be on a military base when the first case hit in Washington, they were cognizant of this is possibly not going to be the last time that we run into this kind of problem. We need to learn how, and they
Yeah.
certainly understand we need to look at this scientifically and how we address it, and so it is incumbent upon us to all take down our walls and say, look, we have a collective problem. How do we address it? And my fear is that there was a family. I grew up in Stanbury, a little small town, and there was a family, actually just a husband and wife, and they opposed every school levy, anything that came up. They were always opposed to things. And I remember my parents saying, "Well, it's easy. It's easier to tear down ideas than it is to get
Oh,
something
sure.
accomplished. You
Yeah.
don't want to listen to people like that because they can seem like it just makes so much sense to be against it. But it is harder to say, let's come together and figure out what's the best way. We're at a threshold now. If the vaccines come out, we're still looking at 6 months where the death, the
Exactly. Right.
morbidity rate could be very much higher if we don't work together."
Mhm. And you brought up something very interesting because since we are today on the topic of coping with the sources of information,
Right.
and we are coping with this need to find a trustworthy source. So before I talk about the vaccine again, so I wanted to pass on the bottom here that when people still doubt. And I think I want to give a little, maybe you could teach us more, Mark, about that. But when people doubt, it's like, I really struggle with this information, or my uncle says this, but I just heard from the news, which is newspapers are trustworthy source. And so one of the ways is just to go and dig deeper. And that's what critical thinking is. Like you said, review different sources, go from one source to another, compare, and then that's what one of the way is a fact check.org. So that's a good website, and there are several websites like this. That, but again, you need to really choose and pick, and talk to other people and professionals. Like, who do I trust when I have a question about economics? Uh, who do I trust when it is about medicine, about COVID? So of course, not your uncle or aunt who have political different, absolutely polarity, but people who are professionals. But also, that's what really got my attention with this article, that a professional put this title that is so catchy that I considered unethical, because it's a sensible and compassionate way how to stop this pandemic. But when we put behind a catchy title something that is actually not giving the solution for the country, but addresses the policies. And imagine if people follow him, there's 6 million people, and then they push these policies and send signatures to the government, and then what happens? Then the new policy will be issued, and then when the next pandemic comes, that policy will be at work, and that's dangerous. So when this author, this professor, talks about the deadliness of lockdown, we need to think about common good. We need to think about how to help everybody, not just those individuals who are healthy or who are fearless, because the common saying is, I'm not worried. And it kind of disarms you because, yeah, this person is very, very sure. But again, is it compassionate? Are you sure about yourself and you disregard anybody else around you? But so, since Mark, you mentioned vaccine, and it will take another 6 months, this is where I invite us to end. Because again, since we are talking about the ethics of journalism and publication and science, like when it started, remember how many sites offered, including Facebook, offered masks, and then they were fake.
Oh, yes.
So I personally got caught up. I purchased quite a few masks, and then they never came. So now I've learned that with vaccine, there are lots of false and fake sites that offer this information that vaccine is ready, vaccine is issued. I don't know how people can do that. So, Mike, what is that way to really have sort of a barrier for such a false information to be published?
Well, there are, there are checks in the system that approves medications that we ought to be able to trust. That blindly looks at all the studies that the individual companies. So the companies do their studies. They do everything possible to make sure they're doing blind studies with non-exposed audiences and the audiences that get the medication, then it goes to another level. So it comes down to, in the thumbnail is, do you trust Dr. Fauci, who's been there for 30 years, who doesn't have a history of just telling us what we want to hear? So part of it is you have to trust that person. Short of that, you want to look at what their motivation is. Why is this guy writing this kind of thing? Well, look at the publication. The next is, don't just watch one newspaper or read one newspaper. Read both,
Yes.
3 or 4 newspapers. Watch Fox. Watch CNN. Get a broad idea of what the debate is out there. But always look for the person's motivation. If a person survives with chaos, they're going to encourage chaos. If someone is kind of slow and said, this is what we have to do, it is a less attractive bit of information to eat, but it's one that you probably ought to take.
And we need to listen to Lydia. If someone pulls out in front of your house and says they have the vaccine, don't trust it. That we need to know that it's going to be the real deal.
Yeah, be skeptical.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we included, go ahead.
Excuse me.
We included today in our publication that we sent to our church members and to the community about the trustworthy site that people can go to. And I will try to, while you're finishing and talking, I will type it here. I just could not open it right away. But I think it's important to go to trustworthy sources when it comes especially to vaccine. Besides that, people look for information not only like to distinguish where is a false site or a real site, but also like what side effects could be with this vaccine. And like you said, vaccine would be administered twice, not in one shot like with the regular flu, but with 2, and they should be administered with the interval. And so all these things people need to know. But for that, that's what I think we need to provide true information, trustworthy information, and then that will decrease the anxiety of people when they have an access right away.
Sure.
So what do you think about that? And I will type that website address on the bottom.
Oh, okay.
I think you're exactly right in what you're saying. And I have to tell you that we're low battery here, and I'm sorry if we fade away. Just understand what happened to us.
Yeah, we are finishing. Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you. I will type it on the bottom. So thank you so much. And
Sure.
I just hope that people will be sensible, really, and
Right.
compassionate,
Right.
but not in a way that that supports and feeds our individualism, but
Sure.
really promote that desire to do common good for everybody.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Say
Thank you
bye.
for
Bye,
Thank
participation
you.
and
guys.
your sharing.
It was
Bye.
Good
good
to
to
see
Bye.
you
see
again.
you. Okay.
Good to see you again.